So we're going to be looking at the Proutist, or what we might call the Sarkarian view of the causes of economic instability. Sarkar, in particular, frequently uses the word depression. What are the causes for economic depressions, which bedevil current economic systems? So, what we're going to do, uh, uh, Sarkar is well known for his brevity, and a lot goes into very short statements. And so I'm going to expand on some statements he made about the causes of economic instability or depressions. And we'll expand on those and look at specific examples of that, and theoretical examples too, from both mainstream and non-mainstream economists. So this is kind of encapsulates his view in a couple brief sentences. There are two main causes for economic depressions. First, the concentration of wealth, where I've emphasized that in terms of inequality, and secondly, blockages in the rolling of money. So we'll see that those two things are very much interrelated. And then he kind of summarizes what's behind that. Economic depressions are actually the net result of suppression, repression, and oppression. That is exploitation. Okay, so let's look at how that works as well. Again, it's all those factors are very much related. Um, examples of great instability, of course, are in the United States, are the recent Great Recession uh, that occurred in 2008, and of course the COVID recession, which could be called a depression for the severity, a lot of economists call the so-called Great Recession a flat-out depression as well. So at the beginning of the Great Recession, inequality and instability actually became quite a hot topic, even among mainstream economists. And this diagram became very well circulated, or widely circulated, I should say. It comes from a Berkeley economist by the name of Emmanuel Saez. He worked very closely with Piketty. That's Thomas Piketty, a French economist. He became quite well known. You might have seen this book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he makes the case that it's inherent in capitalism that inequality is going to increase over time, barring some kind of intervention. So, why did this capture attention? Well, this is the income share going into the top 1%, and we see a peak occurring in 1929. Of course, what great catastrophic event occurred in 1929? Well, I guess I'll answer the question rather than opening it up for hands. Of course, it's the Great Depression. And as a result of the Depression, great fortunes were destroyed, but also policy reforms occurred under the Roosevelt administration. And then, of course, World War II occurred. And that kind of also leveled the playing field. It's not that there were no rich persons, but common people began to benefit more from the economy. Incomes were growing. Um, so the share going to the richest stayed fairly steady for a good portion of the time in the post-war years. And we can kind of look at that as a little bit of a golden era. We might look back at that era in spite of all the problems with racial tensions and so forth, um, as a era of relatively low inequality for capitalism. And then inequality started taking off again for a number of reasons. That's also the period where globalization took off, what we think of as globalization in the modern era, till it reached a peak again in 2007, 2008. So what is that? Of course, it's the time when the Great Recession occurred. So there was a great outpouring of literature about why that there might be a correlation there. Okay, well, the literature looks at potential causes from two perspectives. One is instability comes from above. That has to do with risky behavior of the rich, of elites. And the other area of research is instability coming from below. In other words, people in lower income groups, perhaps middle and lower income, and that has to do with underconsumption. So they're not spending enough to keep the economy going for a number of reasons. And we'll see where consumption in just before the Great Recession remained high. Well, how did that happen? It wasn't due to growing incomes. It occurred because people were taking on a lot of credit, again, increasing instability. So let's look at those things in more detail. So there are what we might call informal arguments for instability coming from above. So one scholar of economic inequality by the name of Milanovic, he explained it in these terms. Well, there's only a limit to the number of Dom Perignons and Armani suits that one can drink or wear. Okay. So, in other words, yes, the rich do consume more than the rest of us, but there's limits to how much more they can consume. All right. Does Bill Gates eat that much more than the rest of us? Well, no, he might eat different things, but there's limits to how much he can, for example, increase his food consumption. Okay. So what do they do with all their money? Well, they save it and they try to invest it. Okay. And uh, as Ravi Batra brought up in 1985 in his articles and book about he was predicting great instability coming up in the 1980s during a time of great increase in inequality. Uh, as he points out, it's kind of standard economic thinking. It's not unique, but to Batra, but he emphasized the fact of decreasing risk aversion. Okay, so yes, as a middle class person, I have some savings, but I'm going to be pretty careful with those savings because, especially at my age, I'm needing those savings for my retirement, right? The rich have surplus savings, and they're going to want to try to get the best return they can for that. So they're open to greater risk. Okay, economists call that decreasing risk aversion. um, And so there's a lot of evidence for that. There's a lot of empirical evidence for that. It's interesting testimony and interviews given by some of the uh, uh, heads of the big Wall Street financial firms that either went bankrupt or uh, got bailed out uh, as a result of the financial crisis leading to the Great Recession. Um, One of them, a former head of Bear Stearns, uh, said some very interesting things. He essentially said, yes, we knew the things that we were selling as investments were pretty much nuts. I'm paraphrasing him. But he said, our customers were making us sell these things. That they were saying, okay, either you provide those things to us or we're going to go elsewhere. In other words, uh, people, very high income people who were the customers of these kinds of investment firms, they were demanding these kinds of products. And so that was formalized by an economist who was researching that at the time. And he provides very clear data showing the link of the growth, linking the growth of these kinds of exotic financial products with growing demand, particularly from hedge funds that serve the wealthy. So hedge funds, you might know, serve people with very high incomes, and they take very high uh, fees from these people with a promise that they're going to be providing above normal returns for their investments. Um, Other studies, again, I probably won't take very much time with these. There's evidence even from China that well, with a breakdown of social safety nets, some people who didn't have money were saving a lot of it. Again, with greater inequality, that's providing some uh, social reinforcement or social necessity for at least for the feeling that we have to save more. And then, well, what do we do with those savings? Well, we look for investments. And there was what one PBS special called kind of a giant pot of money coming from the Far East, invested in the United States, particularly our real estate market, for a number of reasons. A number of economies in the Far East were saving a lot because of experiences of instability there in the 90s, and investing it in the United States, which they believe to be a stable market. Um, Other documentation. There's a guy, actually a journalist by the name of Robert Frank, and his specialty is documenting the behavior of the very rich. And he, in some of his books, he emphasized the idea that consumption by the rich is very unstable. As we saw that there was a drop in the income of the very rich immediately after, the crash, the financial crash leading to the Great Recession, um, because a lot of their income suddenly disappeared because they get a lot of their income from investments. So, when our economy is dependent on consumption by the rich, because a lot of the income produced by the economy goes to the rich, well, that is destabilizing as well. Um, and then there's an economist who's also Robert Frank, and so that he's not confused with the journalist Robert Frank, he's careful to sign all his work Robert H. Frank. But anyway, he talks about an expenditure cascade, and a lot of his work is documenting that. In other words, when the rich dominate society, um, their expenditures kind of set example for the rest of society. And our consumption is not independent. Uh, uh, Behavioral economics is demonstrating that. Much of it's a lot of economists for over 100 years have been talking about that, but it's become more prominent now. Robert Frank is kind of a fairly mainstream economist, but he's documenting that consumption is really social. Um, uh, Good old um, Smith from the 1800s uh, talked about how um, a respectable person in the 1800s, even though a nice shirt is not necessary for survival, would not like to be seen without a nice linen shirt on. Right? Expended, you don't really need a nice linen shirt for survival, but you're going to have it because of social expectations. Well, the very rich set those social expectations, and it kind of cascades down, even among people who are not so rich. And it's not entirely keeping up with the Joneses. For example, people want to buy a nice house in a nice neighborhood so their kids can go to a good school, right? It's not necessarily a matter of greed. Um, but how do they maintain those high levels of consumption that they believe that they're expected to maintain, particularly in a time when wages are not growing, as they have been as has been the case in the United States? Well, they resort to credit. So that's a lot of scholars been talking about how people have been wanting to maintain their consumption uh, through credit. And again, that's largely to maintain social expectations of what they need to be spending to be a respectable person. Okay. Political causation. Again, political capture by elites, government policies that perpetuate inequality, lower tax rates, and so forth. Um, in the Great Recession, we saw policies, again, that served the elites. Banks got bailed out, as we well know, causing considerable public anger, whereas homeowners did not. Okay. Um, then let's look at inequality from below. Uh, how different economists at the time explained it. Mainstream views, Joseph Stiglitz, uh, again, a fairly mainstream, might call him a Keynesian economist, very prominent Nobel Prize winner, um, but considered progressive in his views and his writings. Um, so he again emphasized that the rich have what economists call a lower marginal propensity to consume. In other words, for any additional income that the rich have, they're going to spend less of it. Again, a moderate income household is going to have to spend most of its income in order to maintain its household, whereas the rich are not in that situation. They may be saving and investing most of their income. Okay. That leads to inadequate aggregate demand. Again, the rich play a larger part of consumption, although they have a lower propensity to consume. Aggregate demand is the total spending that occurs in the economy. So again, the argument is inadequate aggregate demand that we mentioned before. And well, in Stiglitz's writing, he kind of goes through a lot of examples. He kind of throws the kitchen sink at it. Examples of government policies: lower taxes on the rich, weakened safety net that again is aggravating um, uh, consumption by lower income people, weakened automatic stabilizers. Um, those refer to things like lower taxes on the rich. That means, well, when there's a downturn, um, you're automatically going to be getting lower taxes, which um, means that you're taking less money out of the uh, I'm sorry, you're taking more money out of the economy, which is kind of counterproductive in a recession situation. And on the other hand, an example of automatic stabilizers would be safety net programs like food stamps or uh, um, uh, unemployment benefits. So when those are weakened, again, people's consumption goes down because of a recession, and that makes the recession worse. Over reliance on monetary rather than fiscal policies. Okay, fiscal policies are things like increased spending, increasing those uh, uh, wage replacements like unemployment benefits, other kinds of social programs, or infrastructure investment. Whereas monetary policy would essentially be increasing or decreasing interest rates, which is considerably weaker in situations like this. Okay, uh, you might be familiar with Richard Reich, uh, uh, prominent economist, very popular, written a number of popular books. So he talks about how families adopted strategies to maintain consumption, similar to what we talked about in the face of stagnant incomes, and he documents how that results in excessive reliance on credit. Okay, so another example, I won't spend a lot of time on this, where uh, uh, these economists use pretty standard modeling techniques, actually modeling techniques that are more frequently used by fairly conservative economists to show that uh, there's that declining worker bargaining power uh, led to the necessity of increased leverage or increased reliance on credit. And that did, in fact, at least in their modeling, using circumstances of the Great Recession, uh, deepen the Great Recession. And their proposed solution was to increase worker bargaining power. Okay. So, in terms of radical views, well, there's not surprisingly a lot of work done at that time by Marxist economists. Now, I'm a little bit reluctant to bring that up to a Proutist audience because Proutists might immediately say, Marxist, whoa, Marx is inherently bad. Um, but let's look at what they're saying, and let's look at how Marxist economists have evolved. In particular, Richard Wolff, he's very much an advocate of economic democracy, as of course is Prout. And you're going to be seeing much more of a convergence among radical economists of different stripes, including Marxists, institutionalists, and others, looking at the benefits of worker cooperatives, and if that is in fact the solution, as we'll see later, that's proposed by P.R. Sarkar. So there's kind of a convergence around this kind of thinking, and Marxists, I think, will largely reject a lot of the abuses and harm caused under the name Marxism that we saw in the 20th century. So again, he would say that it is in fact the system stupid, looking beyond the kind of more marginal reforms called for by the more mainstream progressive economists. So their analysis would emphasize that in the Great Recession, workers were harmed twice. On the one hand, their income from productivity gains were stolen. So as we'll see in future slides here, productivity increased and was steadily increasing during that time, as it has throughout the 20th century. By productivity, we mean the value of that's produced by workers. Okay, so workers were steadily producing greater value, but on the other hand, their incomes stayed stagnant. So where did that additional income or that additional value go? Well, it went into the pockets of the rich, the mullahs. And I guess we're fairly comfortable as Proutists with that term as well. So, but how were they harmed twice? Well, they took that additional income, that extra money that they had lying around, and said, well, what are we going to do with this? Well, let's lend it back to the workers who want to maintain their consumption. So that was recycled back to workers through loans with interest. So they are harmed twice. The value of their productivity was essentially stolen from them. Marxist view that all value comes from labor. So if labor is not getting that value, that's a kind of theft. Workers then, again, to maintain their consumption, they resorted to taking loans, and then the capitalists, we can call them that, made more money with the interest on their loans. So Wolff emphasizes that could not occur in an economy dominated by democratic worker-managed firms. And I think Proutist would agree with that. Again, there's a formal model using techniques developed by a Polish Marxist economist by the name of Kalecki. So that's called collection modeling. This economist, using those formal kinds of modeling, showed that where, again, workers lose their income, there's loss of worker wages causes both underconsumption and reliance on bubble wealth based consumption. So in other words, it's in the interest of capital to create bubbles. By bubbles, we mean markets that suddenly have assets increase in value, even though there's no basis for the increase in the values. It's pure speculation. Okay, again, evidence from that. Some of you might be familiar with some of these diagrams. They come from an organization called Inequality.org. These are kind of dated. Unfortunately, I had some trouble downloading more recent diagrams because I've got a new computer and new software that I'm kind of struggling with. Um, but I assure you that the trends really continued over the past decade. So we see some growth for upper middle class. We might say from the 60 to the 80th percentile. No growth in from the middle percentile down. Where do we see income growth? Well, we see it among the uh, not even the top 20%, but or the top 5%, but the top 1%. So yes, the economy kept growing. Who received the proceeds of that growth? Well, the top 1%. Even after the Great Recession, after the economy started growing again for a good number of years, uh, about 95% of that, the benefits of that growth went to the top 1%. Okay, other factors for concentration of wealth during that time, again, emphasized by radical economists, what we might call financialization. So, an indicator of that percent of profits going to the financial sector. Um, as recently as the 1960s, um, that the financial sector was responsible for only less than 15% of the profits produced in the United States. Going to the period just before the Great Recession, it goes up to 40%. Again, how is that possible? Well, it's because the rich have a lot of money to throw into the financial sector. And so you have an economy that's has been called the casino economy, where the rich are looking for high returns um, on their excess income, and they're throwing it into the financial sector, and it becomes very profitable. These firms make very high profits, serving the rich, again, promising them very high returns with ever more speculative kinds of investments, essentially skimming off the rest of the economy by moving money around. Okay, so again, demonstrating exploitation. Again, the factor emphasized by Sarkar. Again, real family income versus productivity. So the value of work continued uh, uh, to grow, whereas incomes remain stagnant. And again, the trend continues over the past decade. This is dated, but the trend continues. So when I show this to my class, that frequently causes some jaws to drop and some gasp when people realize that they have in fact been systematically exploited with our economy. Um, so specifically with the Great Recession, more specific kinds of exploitation. Um, uh, Poor neighborhoods in particular were targeted for predatory lending. It used to be that in these neighborhoods you couldn't get a house a loan. There was so-called redlining, and then suddenly the um, industry realized there's a great deal of money to be made from these neighborhoods, and so they were specifically targeted for marketing loans, and they were predatory. So a lot of these households in these sorts of neighborhoods, they were sold these predatory kinds of mortgages, even though the individuals would have qualified for very conventional and more safe kinds of mortgages. So we saw so-called ninja loans. Ninja standing for no income, no jobs. Loans were given out, and sometimes uh, loan or borrowers were encouraged by the lenders to give fraudulent data. And then they would charge them excessive fees for the loans, and get them to refinance the mortgages frequently. Every time the mortgage is refinanced, the firms would get very fat fees. And then after the House of Cards began to collapse, there were fraudulent foreclosures. There was so-called robo-signing, whereas the banks would not actually examine loans like they were supposed to. So there were foreclosures actions even uh, on loans that were being paid regularly. Um, so again, these kinds of policies were encouraged by the biggest banks and the government as well before the crash. And so again, policy in action. There's uh, been, well, we can say perhaps some token prosecutions of the wrong people. The biggest, most serious actors were not prosecuted. Okay, then uh, to look at the so-called halt in the rolling of money. How does that happen? Well, when there's a crisis, money suddenly stops circulating in a capitalist economy. Who controls that circulation? Well, it's the banking system. So Sarkar talks about these sorts of problems in the banking system specifically, and he attributes it very simply to greed. Again, banks were uh, bailed out, hoping that that would increase the so-called rolling of money. Again, that's a Sarkarian term, not a term that's used in the banking system. But that didn't happen. So the banks took advantage of the bailouts, but they were very slow to start circulating money again, particularly in terms of lending. So what this is a diagram of excess reserves. Essentially, that's money available for lending in the banking system. Usually, there's going to be that's going to be kept very low. We see that it's essentially about zero historically for decades. Why? If banks want to make money on their money, they don't want it just sitting around. Okay, so we see a little blip here um, where that's after the 9/11 incident, where the Twin Towers were attacked. So, in abundance of caution, the Federal Reserve injected a lot of money into the banking system. So we see a little bit of a blip in excess reserves, just to make sure if there was a panic, people wanted to withdraw their money, there'd be plenty of money in the banking system. Okay, but still, it's not so significant. Well, here we see the financial system become completely spook and essentially collapse, and they stop lending. They will not even the most qualified borrowers, most qualified businesses cannot get routine loans to conduct their routine business. So during the Great Depression, or at the beginning of the Great Depression, it happened again at that time. Uh, uh, Policymakers were calling it a banker's strike. So essentially, we had a banker's strike again, whereas they were hoarding all their money. So money was not circulating. So we see it in this huge spike of excess reserves. So after this, we see that the Federal Reserve getting into the action. Well, let's try to get more money circulating. So they institute what's known as quantitative easing. Again, injecting trillions of dollars into the banking system. So we see these uh, additional rises in excess reserves. Um, but it was took nearly a decade for this to kind of work itself out, and it still hasn't completely worked itself out to get more towards. We still have higher than historic excess reserves, but it has been gradually falling. Of course, with the uh, COVID crisis, there was more quantitative easing, so that's a factor in our having high excess reserves, and of course that's now been reversed by the Federal Reserve while they try to make it again create expectations that they're getting serious with inflation. So, Sarkar's solution, he specifically talks about as the solution being in the cooperative system, and other radical thinkers, again, as we've seen, have come to the same conclusion. Well, why would that be? Um, well, the cooperative system, an economic system where cooperatives is the dominant means of production, is going to be inherently more stable. Well, we saw the problems that come from inequality. There's going to be inherently less inequality. So if you're a cooperative member, yes, you will agree that your manager deserves a higher income. Do they deserve an income that's 400 times what other workers earn? Well, no, nobody's going to agree to that. That just uh, uh, is not logical. It would not make sense. Yes, you want to provide some incentive for special skills, special abilities, and so forth, but it's not going to be excessive. So there's going to be less inequality. Oh, I'm sorry. Uh, there's going to be inherently less inequality, less unemployment. When you're essentially a partner in the firm, if there's a downturn, you're not going to vote to fire yourself, right? And there's a kind of friendship and collegiality that occurs in a cooperative. And so, workers are not going to want to fire their fellow workers. They might lower their wages, for example. That does not happen under capitalism. It's very hard to lower wages in a market system. So workers are laid off instead. So that increases the severity of a recession. Um, uh, if workers maintain some level of income, at least enough to keep them going, they're not going to be fired. Um, Again, that there might be somewhat of a downturn, but it's not going to be severe. The economy is not going to go down as far. So that's going to lead to a faster recovery as well. Okay, when you don't go down as far, it's more easy for you to recover. Again, when there's some recovery, people start buying stuff again from cooperatives. That's reflected in people's incomes very quickly, and so there a positive cycle occurs, and pretty soon the economy is back where it was in the beginning. So um, that's what I have for you. Let's see. I think I did also have something to well, I was going to say something about the COVID recovery also. Yes, there is some exploitation. Let's see, do I have a slide about that? Okay, so the COVID-19 depression, I think we kind of went over that kind of so it is kind of on the one hand, and on the other hand, kind of thing that economists are known for. Yes, there was exploitation there. Certainly, low income workers were hurt most, and there's plenty of documentation about that, and that certainly hurt the recovery. Of course, that's something like that could affect a Proutist economy as well. But we think, again, I presented reasons that we think that recovery would be more rapid. That would necessarily cause some production to go down. On the other hand, we did have a relatively fast recovery because we did I think elites, political leaders were very, very scared that we might be going into a great recession. Nobody wants to be blamed for that. And so they did things that were not done during the Great Recession. So there was some kind of consensus among most economists that we should have probably done more in response to the Great Recession to fight the Great Recession, more fiscal policy, for example. And the fact that we didn't because of political infighting very likely prolonged the recession. And so Biden in particularly did not want that to happen. And so there was a really relatively huge amount of new government spending. Unemployment benefits became very generous, for example, tax benefits to low income people, and that led to an actual reduction in child poverty during a depression situation. So it was definitely unheard of. So even those relatively small steps that were taken to limit the kind of exploitation we saw during the Great Recession were beneficial and led to a relatively fast recovery from the COVID-19 depression. So we have a little time left. I would like to open it up to questions. Let me stop my screen share so I can see more of you. And perhaps, John, maybe if people want to raise hands, maybe you can call on people. It might be easier for you to see hands raised or questions that come into the chat. Maybe I can look in the chat too.
Yeah, maybe check the chat. There were some points made there. I'm checking to see.
Contact by email. Let me enter that.
Josh has his hand up.
Okay. Other things. Okay. Yeah, Robert Reich. Thank you. I knew as it left my mouth, I got it wrong. So,
Prakash has a question.
yeah. Oh, why don't you go ahead, Prakash?
Yeah, I was thinking that you talked about what happened in the response to COVID and how the recovery was quick. Well, two things happened. One was that the wealthy increased, the billionaires increased by over $1 trillion. The Fortune 4. So it really accelerated the inequality, and the downturn in child poverty was directly the result of a tax policy of giving
exactly.
enhanced child credit, which lasted 1 year and then it was voted against. So it was like, so that was a fiscal policy, not a monetary policy, and had an immediate effect.
Yes.
So yeah. So it shows how
Yes.
quickly government actions can actually can change things.
Yes.
How there was an
So,
encouragement for the wealthy to get even wealthier.
mhm.
They weren't being hurt by any of the policies of the government during the pandemic.
Yeah. So we could say that even without radical changes, things could be done to increase stability and increase economic justice, but uh, capitalists kind of can't help themselves. They get overconfident and their greed-related kind of push. Their greed dominates, and their outsized impact on policy results.
I think Alex may have a question or comment.
Yeah, please.
I just want to first of all say thank you, Mark, for joining us for this evening for a very illuminating presentation and kind of a pretty thorough introduction to a couple key points of Sarkar that I think are very relevant for us all to know chapter and verse. And thank you for presenting how you have so far. One of the things that has always raised my eyebrows when I came across it was that Sarkar called for the abolition of the stock market system as a whole. And this is such a foreign concept to us, especially in the United States, because we're taught to think that we are supposed to invest our pensions, our life savings, everything that we can spare, that it magically grows exponentially forever. And this idea that a house can multiply in value over 10 or 15 years many times over, it has its downsides, doesn't it? And I was curious if you would like to speak a little bit more about the speculative nature. You spoke in depth about some of the causation of the aggregate spending power of the upper classes and how that affects things. I'm interested especially in the financialization and speculation aspect that is driven by excessively extracting wealth from some objects, and the notion that people that live in a far off area can own huge amounts of stock and shut down a factory in a local area, and those workers in that community has no real say in the system. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more. Thank you.
Yes. So there's what you describe is again describing injustice piled on injustice, and Prout, of course, as you say, was shut down all kinds of speculative markets. Actually, Brother Tapan and I are starting to embark on a research project looking at, well, how is capital going to be raised in a Proutist system? Again, it's not going to be through these kinds of speculative markets. So how are we going to do it? We don't have answers yet, but it's something that we're going to explore. So investment decisions have to be made locally. Again, that's why one reason that Prout calls for a localized economy, and that's really a foreign foreign concept, particularly to mainstream economics. The theory is that money is going to go where it's most efficiently used anywhere in the world. And well, we can demonstrate that that's not particularly true. I don't know. Am I getting at what you're thinking about, Alex?
Um, I was kind of leaving it to you, to be honest. I'm extremely interested in the apparatus of government has gotten completely behind the notion that there should be protocols of deregulation, um, that the gloves can come off of the big banks in terms of limiting commercial banking from private banking sectors, for instance. That's considered an extremely dangerous area that limitation was removed. Could you speak a little bit about that and about the susceptibility of the banking system to overextend and then just they lose their minds on speculation?
Sure. It comes to mind an economist by the name of Minsky, Ravi Batra, who really talked about inequality and instability before it was cool, so to speak. Uh, he's also influenced, or at least cites Minsky as well. And a lot of so-called institutionalist economists look to Minsky. But his main idea was that um, there's maybe a crisis which leads to financial reform, as occurred in the wake of the Great Depression. And then for decades, we had relative stability in the financial sector. Part of that was, Alex maybe can help me. What is the name of the law separating investment banking from commercial banking?
Is it the Dodd Act?
Glass-Steagall.
Glass-Steagall, yeah,
Glass-Steagall,
that's the first
yes.
version of it, right?
So Glass-Steagall lasted for decades, and kind of in keeping with Minsky's theory that after some time, everything looks to be fine. So the banking sector says, look, everything's just fine. We can introduce this new program. We can introduce that new program. Eventually, that regulatory regime erodes. An example of that would be in the 1990s under good old Clinton. Again, there was kind of bipartisan mania for deregulation then. Not kind of neoliberal ideas being thrown out. And so, yes, that law separating, for example, commercial banking from investment banking being those big banking houses like Bear Stearns and Goldman Sachs that deal with stocks and bonds and things like that, and your neighborhood bank that would be called a commercial bank. So there was a strict separation there. Did that directly cause the Great Recession? Well, probably not, but overall deregulation and kind of the trend towards looking the other way. And a lot of enforcement is kind of discretionary. So enforcement goes way down. And we see that before the Great Recession. So after the Great Recession, there was, again, some reforms that were implemented, again, response to the crisis in keeping with Minsky's theories. That was the Dodd-Frank set of laws. Is that likely adequate? Well, again, what endangered the system was so-called too big to fail banks. that had to be bailed out. So after the Great Recession, after the consolidations of failed institutions and so forth, the big banks are even bigger. So is it credible that Dodd-Frank is going to save us from the next crisis? Well, we'll see. A lot of mainstream economists are saying no.
Wilder actually has a question in the chat. I could read it, or if it's easy for you to see it.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and read it so I don't have to find it?
One solution Sarkar recommends is a cap on wealth. Do you see this being a possibility in the U.S., or will we have to wait for gradual movements to cooperatives and unions?
Well, let's be precise. He doesn't call for a cap on wealth, and I think a lot of Proutists use that term. It's not really accurate. What he calls for is something more radical, and that is that any wealth has to come with social permission, with permission from the collective body. In other words, it comes only under circumstances where it serves the collective good. So can we do something short of that? Again, Piketty calls for a global wealth tax. Well, that's even seen as a pie in the sky, having a wealth tax. Almost all other economists were laughing at that just because they don't think it's politically realistic, because they don't see that see anyone overcoming the power of the wealthy, and that would allow even that to be implemented. So again, something could be done like taxing the wealth to at least somewhat limit the power of wealth. But that's seen as unrealistic. And before even the 1980s, we had over 90% income tax on the very wealthy, really confiscating income taxes. Nobody's advocating that politically. So are we going to see significant reductions in inequality short of systemic change? Well, to say it could be done. Proposals have been put out there. Those things would help, and they would actually stabilize capitalism, which would be to the long-term benefit of capitalists. But I think we're not likely to see it.
I want to be sensitive about time. We had a little bit of a late start, but maybe one final question. I think for many people, there's clearly a lot of interest in this topic and trying to better understand, the real dynamics at play in the economy. Besides Sarkar's works, is there any particular author or book that you would recommend to people at this point? As really capturing, some analysis that's consistent with Prout, and also gives people a good overview of the true dynamics at play right now in the economy.
Well, there is Richard Wolff, and whether he knows it or not, I would consider him an ally. I think his book is kind of telling. Capitalism hits the fan. Let's see, what else? Well, if we
Robert Reich.
Sure, Reich, any of the more mainstream authors, Stiglitz had a book. A lot of books came out during that time, kind of detailing the abuses in the financial sector.
By any chance, are you familiar with William Robinson? I think he's in the UC system. Maybe I can't remember, one of the universities. Global Civil War, Capitalism, Post-Pandemic. And
It doesn't ring a bell, but
and he has
yeah.
another book that came out around the same time about, can capitalism endure? But yeah, he really touches on some interesting things that are evolving now. And one of the things he points out is what you shared, is that when capitalism hits a systemic crisis, it has to sort of come back from the ashes, in effect. And there have been those resets that came out of things like the Great Depression. And one of the things he's pointing out is, there's sort of, I guess, just obstacles to it continue to just be a pure growth. And so one of the things I think he touches on is digitalization, or almost the fourth industrial revolution, is starting to have ramifications about how just massive the amounts of information is available, and the ease with which, money and et cetera can move so quickly all over the planet. And it kind of links into, I can't remember if he really touches on it, but just the incredible amount of tax avoidance that is creating such a huge, aggregation of assets in very limited, sort of dynastic family hands and transnational corporations. But anyway, I think, if you think of some other books that you would recommend, we could post those, along with the recording, because I think many people are interested in trying to learn more and understand more, about what's going on, as we're clearly in a period of tremendous change.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good idea. Yeah. To respond to what you said, that sorry, I was going to make a point and now I forgot what it was. But
Yeah.
that's
Well,
it.
I do want to thank you. I think many people have been quite appropriate in thanking you for a great presentation. And I think it really gets to the point. I mean, it's one thing to read some of P.R. Sarkar's works, but I think the application of some of that in very pragmatic, real ways is really beneficial for all of us. And I think we look to people like you and a few others that really have that kind of an insight and capacity to make it intelligible to all of us that aren't economists by trade, or but I think the pressing need for more and more people to better understand, what is going on is there. And like your presentation this evening was wonderful for those of us in attendance. And quite honestly, I think will benefit people for a long time, just in the fact that it's a recorded presentation and will go into the Prout Alliance library and be available to people in the future. So Professor Friedman, I thank you very much. It's been a wonderful evening and presentation. And thank you all for the people that were able to attend in person. Have a great evening.